In the world Adrian Cross ruled, pain had rules of its own, and if you couldn't prove it, it wasn't real. Every time his assistant swayed on his feet, every time his hand pressed too quickly against his side, Adrian saw only one thing, a lie dressed up as suffering. He tested him anyway. Warehouse floors, endless staircases, one accusation after another, certain that real agony never needed an excuse. But underneath that silence was something Adrian never expected. Scars carved deep into skin, hidden for 6 years, waiting for the one moment his control would finally break. What was he really hiding beneath that shirt? And why did Adrian's whole world shift the second he saw it? Get ready to meet Milo Hart, a man who spent 6 years hiding surgical scars from a Mafia boss, convinced his pain was nothing but an act. If you've ever pushed through a rough day just so nobody would ask if you were okay, tell us in the comments, because we see you. The pain caught beneath my ribs before I even reached the end of the long fluorescent-lit corridor that led to his office, the same corridor I walked almost every day and had never once managed to cross without first rehearsing how I was going to stand. I stopped with one hand flat against the wall, grateful the corridor was empty at that hour, and waited for the spasm to loosen, counting my breaths carefully without making a sound anyone could hear through the doors on either side of me. 3, 4, 5. The pressure stayed exactly where it was, deep, sharp, deliberate, as though something inside me had hooked its fingers around old scar tissue and pulled. Behind the closed office door, Adrian Cross was already waiting, the way he was always waiting, patient and precise, like a man who had never once had to hurry for anything in his entire life. In a district of the city, he ran the way other men ran clocks. Keeping the head of the Cross Syndicate waiting was dangerous. Giving him a reason to think I was weak was worse. I straightened before the guard stationed outside could notice, tugged the hem of my shirt lower over my waist, and stepped inside. Adrian stood behind a broad desk, one palm resting beside a stack of shipping ledgers, thick enough to have taken someone all night to prepare. He didn't look angry. Anger would have been easier to survive. His face held the calm, unreadable stillness that usually arrived right before someone lost money, territory, or the privilege of walking out of that office on their own 2 feet. His eyes moved from my face to the hand I'd pressed against my side without realizing it. I lowered it a beat too late. "You're late," he said. 2 minutes. My voice came out steadier than I felt. The elevator. It wasn't entirely a lie. The elevator had, in fact, been slow. But the elevator wasn't the reason I'd stood outside his door for nearly a full minute first, one hand braced against the corridor wall, waiting for the room to stop tilting before I trusted myself to walk in a straight line. Adrian didn't need to know that part. Nobody needed to know that part. I crossed the room, and the next step sent heat tearing through my abdomen, stealing the air clean out of my lungs. My knee buckled. I caught the edge of a chair before it could scrape across the floor and give me away with the sound of it. Adrian watched the whole motion, start to finish. He didn't come closer. "It'll pass," I said, before he could ask. "Convenient." He picked up one of the ledgers and turned a page without looking at it. "Every time I require something from you, you suddenly can't stand upright." The accusation landed harder than it should have. Maybe because he said it so quietly, maybe because I'd heard versions of it before, from people who wanted visible proof before they'd grant me the basic dignity of being believed. I kept my eyes on the papers instead of his face. I came, didn't I? After making everyone rearrange their schedule around me? Another pulse tightened beneath my skin. My spine bent before my pride could stop it. I covered the motion by reaching for the back of the chair. But Adrian had already set the ledger down, the soft tap of paper against wood sounding final enough that I looked up. "I'm not doing anything," I said. "That's exactly the problem." He came around the desk. Each step measured, unhurried. His presence filled the room the way it always did, long before he actually reached me. You disappear the moment work becomes difficult. You go pale the second you're questioned. And now you're clutching your side like you expect me to excuse whatever comes next. I could have answered him honestly. The explanation lived right behind my teeth. But giving it shape meant opening a door I'd kept bolted for 6 years. Once people learned there had been a surgery, they wanted the details. Once they had the details, their eyes changed. Some grew curious. Others grew careful in the cruelest way, treating me like a cracked vase, while still doubting every ache they couldn't personally witness. I had watched it happen to me once already, with someone who was supposed to love me. I wasn't going to hand Adrian Cross the same weapon. He stopped an arm's length away. "Look at me." I obeyed, because refusing would only sharpen his suspicion. His gaze searched my face for the flaw in what he'd already decided was a performance. Sweat had gathered at the back of my neck. I could feel it sliding beneath my collar. "Tell me what you're trying to avoid," he said. "Nothing." "Then stand straight." I tried. My muscles locked halfway. A tremor ran the length of my legs, slight but impossible to hide from a man whose entire life depended on reading small things correctly. Adrian's mouth hardened. "You expect me to believe this?" The room seemed to narrow around his voice. My fingers curled against my palm. I'd learned a long time ago that arguing only made people watch closer, and being watched only made mistakes more likely, so I said nothing. Silence had protected me before. This time it convicted me. Adrian turned away with an exhale that carried more disgust than anger. I have no patience for manipulation. Something in me went still, not the pain, which kept spreading toward my spine in a slow, punishing line, but the small, foolish hope that he might notice the difference between someone performing for attention and someone doing everything in their power to escape it. "I'm not manipulating you," I said. He glanced back over his shoulder. "Then prove it." My hand moved instinctively toward the hem of my shirt. I caught myself before my fingers reached the fabric. Adrian noticed anyway. His eyes dropped to the aborted motion, then lifted back to my face. For 1 second, something other than certainty crossed his expression. Curiosity. That single second frightened me worse than his accusation had. I stepped back. The chair struck the back of my knees, and I sat down harder than I meant to. Pain flashed white across my vision, and a small, involuntary sound escaped me before I could swallow it. Adrian's expression shifted, not into sympathy, but into focus. Sharp, deliberate attention. He moved closer as I folded one arm over my stomach and used the other to keep my shirt pinned firmly in place. The fabric had ridden up when I fell. Cool office air touched the lowest edge of skin I'd spent years keeping covered. I yanked the material back down too quickly. His gaze followed the movement of my hand. "What are you hiding?" I looked away, breathing through the ache while every instinct in my body screamed to put distance between his eyes and the marks beneath my clothes. Until that moment, Adrian Cross had believed my pain was theater. He had no idea how much of my body I'd hidden just to let him keep believing it. What was I hiding? He didn't repeat the question. He simply watched me, waiting for the answer I refused to give. That silence was worse than shouting would have been. If he'd raised his voice, I could have hidden behind anger of my own. His quiet left nowhere to stand. I lowered my arm from my stomach before he could mistake the gesture for another act, though the motion sent a dull ache spreading sideways across my ribs. "Nothing," I said. My voice sounded thinner than I intended. He studied me a moment longer, then stepped back. "Good, then you'll have no problem accompanying me this afternoon." My head came up. "Where?" "One of the warehouses." His tone left no room for negotiation. "There's inventory to inspect, records to verify, and 3 shipments delayed because people have apparently decided excuses are an acceptable substitute for results." I understood the message hidden inside the words. He wasn't assigning me work because it had to be done. He was testing whether my pain would conveniently vanish the moment it became inconvenient. I nodded anyway. Refusing would only confirm every suspicion he already carried. I hadn't always been this careful. There had been a time, not so long ago, when I let someone see everything: the surgery, the months of recovery, the nights I couldn't sleep because my own body felt like a stranger's. His name didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what he'd done with the truth once I'd handed it to him, turned it into a story he told at parties, a way to make himself sound patient and noble for staying with someone so fragile. I'd watched people's faces change when they heard it, not toward me, but toward the version of me he'd built out of my worst year, curious, careful, doubting even as they cooed sympathy. That was the year I learned that a scar isn't proof of anything to people who've decided in advance what kind of person you are. It's just another thing they can pick up and use. So I'd stopped handing it out. I told myself it was strength. Most days I still believed that, standing in a Mafia boss's office with my ribs on fire, though. Strength and stubbornness had started to feel like the same word wearing 2 different coats, and I wasn't sure anymore which one I was actually wearing. By the time we left the building, clouds had swallowed the afternoon sun, pressing a heavy gray light over the city. Adrian walked ahead with effortless confidence while I matched his pace half a step behind, measuring every stride like a man crossing ice. The distance between us never changed. Neither did the pressure beneath my ribs. Every uneven seam in the pavement echoed straight through my abdomen. I kept my breathing slow and careful, refusing to let it catch. Men who worked for Adrian noticed everything. Limp once, and the word would travel faster than a bullet. We reached the warehouse district as trucks rolled through the loading gates. Engines rumbled, metal doors slammed, voices bounced off the concrete walls. Adrian started issuing instructions before we'd fully stepped inside, and people moved immediately. No one questioned him. I followed with a clipboard, recording numbers exactly as he dictated them. At first, the work distracted me. Counting crates required enough concentration to dull the sharpest edges of the pain. Then someone shifted a heavy pallet without warning, and I turned too quickly to avoid it. A violent stab ripped across my side. My vision blurred. I caught myself against a steel support beam before my knees could give out completely. The clipboard slipped from my hand and struck the concrete with a crack loud enough to make nearby conversations falter for a heartbeat. Adrian looked over. Irritation crossed his face before concern ever had the chance to arrive. "We're behind schedule," he called out. "If you're going to drop things, at least pick them up." Heat rose to my cheeks. I bent for the clipboard, and halfway down my body simply refused to go any farther. The muscles across my abdomen locked so suddenly that I froze, suspended in the awkward position while sweat slid along my temple. Someone nearby shifted, pretending not to stare. I straightened much more slowly than I meant to. By the time I had the clipboard in hand again, my fingers were shaking hard enough to rattle the pages. Adrian walked over, stopping close enough that no one else could hear him. "Still committed to this?" he asked quietly. I answered without meeting his eyes. "Yes." "Interesting." He folded his arms. "Most people quit performing once they realize no one's buying it." The words settled somewhere deeper than the pain itself. I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because if I admitted how exhausted I actually was, he'd call it another act. If I stayed silent, he called that manipulation too. Every choice funneled toward the same verdict. I signed the inspection sheet and handed it back to him. "Anything else?" He looked genuinely thrown. "You're asking for more work? You said we're behind." For the first time all day, something flickered across his expression that wasn't certainty. It disappeared almost as fast as it came. "Fine." He handed me another folder. "Storage room C, check every sealed container." I accepted it before he could change his mind. Storage room C sat at the far end of the building, away from the noise of forklifts and idling engines. The silence inside felt unnaturally loud. I worked through the inventory one shelf at a time, stopping whenever the tightening beneath my ribs threatened to steal my balance, forcing myself onward after only a few careful breaths. No one was watching here. That should have made it easier. Instead, it reminded me how automatic the hiding had become, because even alone, I waited for the worst of the pain to pass before allowing myself to lean against the shelves. Even alone, my hand drifted toward the hem of my shirt and stopped an inch before touching it. Habit, I was learning, was a harder thing to break than fear. A sharp pulse folded me forward. This time, I didn't catch myself quickly enough. My shoulder struck the metal rack with a hollow clang that echoed the length of the room. I shut my eyes until the wave eased. Footsteps entered from the corridor, calm, unhurried, deliberate. Adrian appeared in the doorway holding the completed inspection sheets. His gaze traveled from the shelf I'd hit to the way I stood with one arm pressed tightly against my side. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched long enough for me to realize he hadn't followed me here to help. He'd followed me here for proof. I straightened before he could say another word, hiding the tremor in my breathing as best I could. He stayed where he was, giving nothing away. Then his eyes dropped again to the hand guarding the lower edge of my shirt, and this time they didn't move away. His attention lingered long enough to make my skin feel exposed even through the fabric. I let my arm fall to my side, though the movement pulled painfully against whatever had tightened inside me. Adrian didn't speak right away. Instead, he stepped into the storage room and closed the distance with slow, deliberate strides until only a narrow aisle separated us. "Move your hand," he said. It wasn't curiosity. It was an order. I shook my head once. "Get back to the inventory." His jaw tightened. "You don't get to ignore me." I reached for the next container instead, pretending the label deserved my full attention. The numbers blurred in front of my eyes. I copied them anyway, hoping my handwriting looked steadier than my pulse felt. Adrian plucked the clipboard from my hands before I finished the line. "Look at me." I did, because refusing would only waste what little strength I had left. "If you're injured," he said, "I'll have someone examine you. I'm fine. You're not convincing. I wasn't trying to be." That answer seemed to irritate him more than another denial would have. "Then explain why you've spent the entire day acting like every step is torture." I swallowed against the bitterness climbing my throat. "Because it hurts." "That's not an explanation. It's the truth." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Truth doesn't usually change, depending on who's watching." The words settled between us like a locked door. I realized then that nothing I said could matter while he believed pain had to perform in a way that made sense to him. If I endured too quietly, I was pretending. If I faltered, I was exaggerating. There was no version of suffering he'd accept without evidence carved into skin. Adrian tossed the clipboard onto a nearby crate. "Come with me." I didn't ask where. He was already walking away. The trek back across the warehouse felt longer than the walk in. Workers stepped aside as Adrian passed, their eyes drifting toward me only after he'd already moved on, each glance disappearing before I could meet it. No one offered help. No one spoke. In this place, his opinion of me shaped everyone else's. If the boss believed I was acting, sympathy became a risk nobody wanted to take. Adrian stopped beside a raised loading platform where several shipment records waited to be checked. "You'll finish these." I looked at the stack. It would require climbing the narrow metal stairs again and again, comparing documents against cargo stored on 3 different levels. He knew that. "Understood," I said. His gaze searched my face as if he'd expected me to protest. When I didn't, he turned and walked toward another section of the warehouse. I watched him disappear behind the shelving before gripping the handrail and starting upward. By the 4th trip, every breath scraped through my chest. By the 6th, my shirt clung damply to my back. I paused only long enough to steady myself before forcing another step. The work itself wasn't impossible. Hiding what it cost me was. A forklift roared somewhere below. Someone shouted measurements across the floor. Life inside the warehouse continued with mechanical precision, while my body negotiated every movement like a separate, hostile argument. Near the top platform, I crouched to compare 2 crate numbers. The instant I shifted my weight, agony shot across my abdomen with enough force to drive the air from my lungs. My vision flashed white. One hand caught the railing before I pitched forward. The other pressed instinctively against the place I'd spent years protecting. I stayed frozen until the wave eased enough to breathe again. "Still putting on the show," a voice called from below. I looked down. Adrian stood at the foot of the stairs, arms folded, watching me without expression. Embarrassment burned hotter than the pain itself. I straightened too quickly, determined to prove I could finish what he'd assigned. My balance betrayed me. The edge of my boot slipped against the grated step, metal ringing beneath my foot, and I lurched sideways, slamming my shoulder into the railing, hard enough to rattle it the entire length of the platform. A startled murmur spread through the workers nearby. I recovered before falling, but not before everyone had seen it happen. Adrian climbed the stairs with controlled, unhurried steps and stopped one below me, close enough that lowering my head would bring us eye to eye. "You've made your point," he said quietly. "Whatever this performance is, it's over." I stared back, breathing through clenched teeth. "You think I'd humiliate myself in front of 30 people for attention? I think you're determined to avoid something. You're wrong. Then prove I'm wrong." His voice never rose. That calm certainty hurt worse than any accusation shouted across the warehouse floor could have. Around us, the workers had gone suspiciously busy, reorganizing documents that were already stacked, pretending not to listen while missing nothing. My fingers tightened around the railing until my knuckles went white. For one reckless heartbeat, I almost reached for the buttons of my shirt. I almost ended it right there, on a loading platform in front of strangers, just to make the accusations stop. But memory arrived faster than the impulse, the endless questions that would follow, the pity dressed up as kindness, the disbelief that always crept back in the moment the scars disappeared beneath clothing again. I'd lived that exact sequence once before, with someone who was supposed to protect me, instead of putting me on display, who had turned my worst year into a party anecdote about his own patience. I wasn't doing it twice. not even to make a warehouse full of strangers stop staring, not even to make Adrian Cross stop looking at me like I was a puzzle he intended to solve by force. I forced my spine straight and made myself walk the rest of the platform, refusing to let my arms so much as brush the folder I still had to hold. The warehouse emptied by degrees as daylight faded behind the high windows. Forklifts fell silent one after another, leaving only scattered footsteps and the occasional slam of a rolling door. I finished the last inventory sheet with cramped fingers, my handwriting growing uneven toward the bottom of the page. Every line I completed felt less like work and more like a bargain I was making with my own body. Just one more shelf, one more signature, one more minute before I could finally stop pretending I wasn't reaching my limit. I carried the completed file toward Adrian's office near the loading bay. The short walk should have taken less than a minute. Halfway there, another surge hit without warning, sharper than anything that had come before, driving so deep through my abdomen that my knees buckled. I caught the corner of a wooden crate before I hit the floor and closed my eyes until the dizziness settled enough to let me breathe again. Voices drifted nearby. Someone noticed, someone else glanced toward Adrian's office before quietly turning away. No one crossed the distance. They'd already learned whose judgment mattered. I pushed myself upright and kept walking. Each step felt disconnected from the last, as if I were convincing my legs individually to keep moving. When I reached the office, Adrian was reviewing shipping manifests beneath a single desk lamp. He accepted the folder without looking up. Finished? Yes. He flipped through several pages, scanning the numbers with practiced speed, no missing entries. His approval lasted only a heartbeat before his eyes lifted to me. Interesting. A man supposedly in unbearable pain managed to complete every assignment. I almost smiled. There was something cruelly predictable about it. If I had failed, my pain would have been dismissed as an excuse. Because I'd succeeded, it became evidence that I'd never been hurting in the first place. There was no outcome that could have satisfied him, and some part of me, a tired, resigned part, had already known that before we ever left headquarters. You gave me work, I said quietly. I did it. Exactly. Which proves you could have spared us this performance from the beginning. I looked at the floor instead of arguing. The boards beneath my feet blurred for a moment before sharpening again. Go home, he said. Get some rest. Tomorrow I expect the dramatics to be over. I nodded once and turned toward the door. Pride carried me through the first few steps. After that, momentum did the rest. Outside, evening air met my face with unexpected coolness. I reached the parking area before the strength holding me together finally slipped. I leaned against a concrete pillar, one hand pressed firmly against my side while the other searched blindly for balance. My breathing turned shallow, uneven. The pain no longer came in waves. It stayed constant and merciless, as if every movement throughout the day had woken something that refused to quiet down again. I waited until the worst passed, then forced myself into the driver's seat of my car. Turning the key demanded more effort than it should have. The drive home blurred into red traffic lights and aching silence. By the time I unlocked my apartment door, my hands were trembling badly enough that I missed the lock twice. Inside, I rested my forehead against the closed door without bothering to switch on the lights. The apartment was empty, safe enough that I could finally stop pretending. I slid slowly down to the floor, drawing one careful breath after another while my whole body shook with exhaustion. My hand drifted toward the lower buttons of my shirt before I even realized what I was doing. I stopped. Even here, alone with no one to see, exposing the scars felt impossible. 6 years had turned concealment into instinct, a reflex older and stronger than logic. Instead, I swallowed 2 pain tablets with a glass of water and waited for a relief that barely came. I almost didn't make it to the car. A woman from the loading crew, Sophia, the only one who'd ever bothered to learn my name instead of just Cross's assistant, fell into step beside me in the corridor before I reached the exit. She didn't touch me. She didn't ask if I was all right, the way people did when they wanted permission to stop worrying about it 30 seconds later. You dropped this earlier, she said instead, holding out a pen I didn't remember losing. It was an excuse, and we both knew it. Her eyes flicked once toward the hand I had pressed against my side, then politely away, the way you'd look away from someone crying in public because they clearly didn't want an audience. Thanks, I said. He's not usually like this. She kept her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry past the two of us. Careful, I mean. He's careful with numbers. People, not so much. A pause. For what it's worth, I don't think you're lying. Why not? Because liars ask for less, not more. She nodded toward the folder still tucked under my arm, the one I'd requested myself back in the first warehouse, just to prove a point that no one but Adrian was even keeping score on. She hesitated, like she was deciding whether the next part was hers to say. My brother spent 2 years telling our whole family he was fine, wasn't fine. Nobody believed him until it was almost too late, and by then believing him didn't fix anything. It just meant we finally stopped making him prove it every single day. She shrugged, like the sentence cost her something to hand over. I don't need to see whatever you're hiding under that shirt to know what it looks like when somebody's spent years getting good at hiding it. Get home safe, Milo, she said, and turned back toward the loading bay before I could figure out how to thank her properly, for either the pen or the rest of it. It wasn't much, it didn't fix anything. But it was the first time all day that someone had looked at me and seen something other than a test to pass or fail, and I carried that small, strange comfort with me all the way back to my car, where it sat beside the panes instead of underneath it. Morning arrived after a night measured in fragments rather than sleep. Standing hurt, sitting hurt, even reaching for a mug in the cabinet tightened the old wound beneath my skin. I considered calling Adrian. The phone stayed in my hand for nearly a minute. One sentence would have been enough. I can't come in today. But I already knew the answer waiting on the other end. Another excuse, another performance, another lie added to a list he was clearly keeping. I set the phone back down. By the time I reached headquarters, every step required deliberate concentration. Adrian was already issuing orders for the day when I walked in. His gaze found me immediately. You're late again. Barely a minute. I opened my mouth to say more, but the room tilted before the words arrived. I steadied myself against the edge of a table. Adrian's expression hardened instead of softening. If you're trying to avoid today's schedule, he said, it won't work. He placed another file in front of me without hesitation. You're coming with me. I lowered my eyes to the folder. My fingers stayed motionless beside it. I knew I should pick it up. I knew refusing would only deepen every suspicion he already carried. But for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't sure my body would survive another day of proving something to a man who had already decided the truth for both of us. My fingertips never reached the folder. They hovered inches above the worn cover, while another wave of pain climbed through my abdomen with relentless precision. I closed my hand before anyone could notice it shaking. Pick it up, Adrian said. His voice stayed level, almost bored. We're wasting time. I looked at the file, then at him. For days I'd answered every accusation with silence, every order with obedience. Neither had changed his mind, neither had protected me. I drew one slow breath. I can't. The room fell quiet. Adrian tilted his head slightly, as though he'd been waiting for exactly those words all along. There it is. He stepped closer until the edge of the desk was all that separated us. The excuse. I held his gaze. No. Then what? A limit? His expression barely shifted. People reach their limits after they've done everything they can. You've been reaching yours since the moment we met. A few of the men nearby lowered their eyes, pretending to organize documents that had already been stacked twice. Nobody spoke. I understood why. Challenging Adrian never ended well, and defending me would mean questioning his judgment out loud, in front of everyone. He slid the folder toward me with 2 fingers. Take it. I remained still. Take it, he repeated, or admit you've been lying from the beginning. Something inside me tightened harder than the injury ever could. It wasn't anger. It was exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones after explaining yourself over and over to people who've already decided not to listen. I wrapped my fingers around the folder. The motion alone sent a sharp pull through the old scar tissue. I turned away before anyone could see the wince I failed to hide completely. We drove in silence. Adrian focused on the road while I concentrated on staying upright with every turn the car made. By the time we arrived at another storage facility on the edge of the city, even climbing out of the passenger seat demanded careful planning. He noticed the hesitation. You managed yesterday. Yesterday cost me today. Or maybe today's performance simply needs a better audience. I answered by walking past him. The building was older than the previous warehouse. Its corridors narrower and poorly lit, dust drifting through shafts of pale morning light. Adrian handed me another inspection list without ceremony. Start downstairs, I accepted it. The first staircase descended into a lower storage level where the air felt cooler and heavier. Halfway down, my foot faltered. I stopped, gripping the railing until the dizziness eased. No one else was there. No one was watching. Instinct still forced me to straighten before taking another step. I reached the basement and began checking serial numbers one crate at a time. The work required frequent bending, and each time I leaned forward, pressure coiled tighter across my abdomen. By the 10th container, sweat had dampened the back of my shirt despite the cold air. I finished one line on the inventory sheet, then another. The letters blurred together. My vision narrowed to a tunnel. A loud metallic crash echoed from somewhere above, and I flinched instinctively. The sudden movement tore through me like a blade. My knees gave way before I even registered losing my balance. I hit the concrete hard enough to drive the remaining breath from my lungs. The clipboard skidded across the floor. For several long seconds, I couldn't move. Every attempt to inhale ended in another stabbing burst beneath my ribs. Footsteps thundered down the stairs. Adrian reached the bottom first. He stopped beside me instead of helping me up. Enough. His voice carried the same cold certainty it always had. This ends now. I tried to push myself onto one elbow. My arm collapsed beneath me. Stand up, I can't. He crouched beside me, irritation replacing whatever patience he had left. Look at me, I did. My vision shimmered at the edges. You expect me to believe this happened because you worked too hard? I opened my mouth, but the pain stole the words before they could form. Adrian reached for my shoulder, intending to pull me upright himself. I reacted without thinking. Don't. The warning came out harsher than I intended. His hand paused. Then his eyes dropped to the way both of my arms had crossed instinctively over my lower torso. Move your hands. I shook my head. Move them, please. It was the first time I'd ever pleaded with him, not because I wanted his sympathy, but because I needed the last piece of privacy I still had left. Adrian mistook the desperation for defiance. His patience snapped. He caught my wrist and pulled it away. I resisted for only a heartbeat before another surge of pain emptied what little strength remained in me. My other hand slipped from my side as well. The fabric of my shirt, already twisted from the fall, rode upward several inches. Time seemed to stop. Pale skin emerged first, then the scars. Long, uneven surgical lines crossed the lower half of my abdomen, old enough to have faded, but far too severe to ever disappear completely. They weren't the thin marks of a routine procedure. They cut across my body in jagged rows that spoke of operating rooms, of months spent relearning how to walk, of pain that had never fully left even after the wounds themselves had closed. Adrian's grip loosened immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the scars, not blinking, not speaking. The conviction that had filled every accusation over the past 2 days vanished so completely that the silence around us felt unfamiliar, almost foreign, like a room neither of us had stood in before. I pulled my shirt back down with trembling fingers. Too late to hide anything now. He didn't try to stop me. He didn't ask another question. He simply stared at the place where the fabric had fallen back into place, as though everything he'd believed about me over the past several days had fractured in a single instant. For the first time since we'd met, Adrian Cross looked at me without judgment. He looked at me as if he had no idea who I really was anymore. Adrian was the first to move. He didn't reach for me again. Instead, he stepped back, as though the space between us had suddenly become something fragile. The silence in the basement no longer belonged to disbelief. It belonged to realization. I gathered enough strength to sit upright, keeping one arm wrapped around myself while my breathing slowly steadied. My shirt stayed firmly in place now, but it hardly mattered anymore. The truth had already escaped. Those scars, his voice, when it finally came, sounded unfamiliar. He stopped before finishing the sentence. For the first time since I'd known him, he seemed to understand that not every question deserved an immediate answer. I pushed myself against a nearby crate until I managed to stand. My legs protested instantly. The concrete floor swayed beneath me, and still I refused to let him catch me if I fell again. "Don't," I whispered. He frowned. "Don't what?" "Don't start looking at me differently." The words surprised even me. I hadn't planned to say them. They'd simply waited too long behind my ribs, searching for a way out. His gaze lowered for a brief moment before returning to my face. "I accused you." "You did," I thought. "I know what you thought." I adjusted my shirt one last time, smoothing wrinkles that no longer mattered. Everyone thinks the same thing, right up until they've seen enough damage to satisfy themselves. A muscle shifted along Adrian's jaw. He looked as though he wanted to deny it, but every conversation we'd had over the last 2 days stood between us, and there was nothing honest he could say against it. He bent to retrieve the clipboard that had slid across the floor and held it out to me. His movements were careful now, almost hesitant. I didn't take it immediately. That small hesitation hurt him more than anger would have. I could see it in the way his fingers tightened around the edge of the board before he quietly set it down on a crate instead. "You should be seen by a doctor," he said. I almost laughed. Not a cruel laugh, just a tired one. "Now?" He didn't answer. "Yesterday you thought I was acting." His eyes dropped briefly. "This morning too. Still nothing. What changed?" He looked at the floor for a long second before speaking. "I was wrong." The apology arrived without decoration, stripped of excuses. In another life, maybe that would have been enough. In this one, the words landed softly against wounds that had already learned not to trust them. I stepped past him toward the staircase. Every movement remained difficult, but something inside me had become strangely lighter. Not because he finally believed me, but because I no longer had anything left to hide from him. Halfway up the stairs, Adrian caught up beside me without trying to take my arm. "Lean on the railing," he said quietly. "You'll be more stable." I didn't answer. "We'll leave the inspection unfinished. I'll send someone else." Another step. "You don't have to finish." Today, I stopped on the landing and looked back at him. Yesterday I did. The sentence settled heavily between us. He understood exactly what I meant. Yesterday he had watched me force my body through impossible work because he believed pain was weakness wearing a different name. Today the work had become optional, only because he'd finally seen evidence carved into my skin. We reached the upper level without another word. Outside, pale afternoon light spilled across the parking area. Adrian unlocked the car, but didn't move toward the driver's seat immediately. Instead, he stood facing me, uncertainty replacing the confidence that usually surrounded him like armor. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question carried no accusation now, only confusion. I rested one hand against the roof of the car until another wave eased enough for me to breathe normally again, because scars only convince people for a moment. I met his eyes, then let mine drift somewhere past his shoulder. The pain stays, their belief doesn't. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Guilt settled where certainty had lived just an hour before. He looked for one unguarded second, like a much younger man than the one who ran an entire district of this city, like someone realizing for the first time that being right about everything else in his life hadn't prepared him to be wrong about this. I didn't tell him it was all right. It wasn't. Not yet, and I'd spent too many years pretending things were fine to hand out that particular lie again, not even to make him feel better. I opened the passenger door myself before he could do it for me. The drive back felt different from every journey we'd shared before. Adrian never once questioned whether I needed to stop. He slowed before every sharp turn. When traffic forced the car to idle, he glanced toward me as though measuring whether I was holding myself together. I noticed every change. None of them erased the memory of everything that had come before it. By the time we reached headquarters, evening shadows stretched across the courtyard. Adrian switched off the engine but made no move to leave. "I'll clear your schedule," he said. "Go home. Rest." I reached for the door handle. My hand paused. Rest. The word felt foreign coming from him, like a language he'd only just started learning. I didn't look back until I reached my apartment building. Adrian's car was already gone. The empty street should have brought relief. Instead, it left me alone with the one thing I'd managed to outrun since this all started, my own thoughts. I climbed the stairs one careful step at a time, unlocked my door, and let the silence close around me. No orders, no accusations, no suspicious eyes following every movement. Just the faint ticking of the kitchen clock and an ache that had settled so deeply inside me it no longer felt separate from my own body. I lowered myself onto the edge of the bed and stayed there without taking off my shoes. The room blurred as exhaustion finally caught up with me. Adrian believed me now. That should have changed everything. It didn't. I closed my eyes and saw his face in the basement again. Not the moment he looked at my scars, but every moment before that. Every time he'd dismissed me. Every order he'd given while I struggled just to stay standing. Every quiet accusation that had convinced me speaking up was pointless. Those memories hadn't disappeared simply because the truth had finally become visible. My phone vibrated on the bedside table. Adrian Cross filled the screen. I watched it ring until it stopped. A minute later, another message appeared. I didn't open it, then another. Neither changed my decision. I turned the phone face down. It wasn't punishment. I simply had nothing left to say. The following morning, sunlight slipped through the curtains before I forced myself out of bed. The pain had eased enough that I could stand without holding the wall, but every movement reminded me that recovery and healing were never quite the same thing. There was a bag outside my door when I finally looked. A small canvas case I didn't recognize, left square in the center of the mat where no delivery driver would have bothered to set it. Inside were two things: a compression wrap, the kind meant for exactly the sort of old surgical strain I'd never described to him in any detail, and a folded note with nothing on it but a phone number and 4 words in handwriting too neat to belong to anyone who wrote often by hand. Dr. Reyes. No questions asked, no signature. He hadn't needed one. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, turning the note over as though the back of it might explain itself. 6 months ago, even 6 days ago, I would have read it as one more test, proof he expected me to admit weakness by using it. Instead, it just sat there in my hand, a small, careful thing that asked nothing of me except to exist if I wanted it to. I didn't call the number. I didn't throw the note away either. I put both the bag and the number in the drawer of my nightstand, where I could reach them without deciding anything yet. I stayed home. Hours passed quietly until someone knocked at the door. 3 soft knocks, not impatient, not demanding. I knew who it was before I'd even crossed the room. My hand rested on the doorknob without turning it. "I know you're inside," Adrian said through the wood. His voice carried none of the authority that usually defined it. I stayed silent. "You don't have to open the door." Another pause. "I only wanted to make sure you were all right." The words should have sounded comforting. Instead, they uncovered something raw inside me. Yesterday, he had needed scars before asking that question. How many times had I wished to hear those same words while I was still being called a liar to my face? I leaned my forehead against the door and closed my eyes. "Go home," I said quietly. The hallway fell silent. "Please." I wasn't asking him to leave because I hated him. I was asking because if I saw regret in his eyes, part of me wanted to believe it instantly, and that frightened me more than anything else had in days. I heard a slow exhale from the other side. I deserve that. His footsteps retreated without another attempt to persuade me. I stayed where I was until even the sound of the elevator disappeared. The apartment felt larger afterward, emptier in a way it hadn't before. I returned to the living room, picked up an untouched glass of water from the table, and stared at it without drinking. For 6 years, hiding my pain had protected me from pity, from questions, from judgment. It had also taught me something I'd never fully understood until now. Once you survive long enough by depending only on yourself, accepting kindness becomes almost impossible, even when it's genuine, especially when it comes from the person who first taught you not to expect it. I thought, too, about Sophia's hand holding out a pen I hadn't dropped, and about how easy it had been to accept kindness from someone who asked nothing of me in return. Adrian's kindness came with a harder question attached, because Adrian was the one who'd made the kindness necessary in the first place. Forgiving a stranger's small mercy cost nothing. Forgiving the man who'd called my pain a performance for 3 straight days, who had watched me climb metal stairs on legs that could barely hold me and called it evidence against me, cost something I wasn't sure I was ready to spend, even now, even with his messages sitting there unanswered and patient on my screen. I thought about my mother once telling me, back before the surgery, back before any of this, that the people worth keeping were the ones who apologized, without being cornered into it first. Adrian hadn't been cornered. He'd had every excuse available to him. I'd given him nothing but silence and stubbornness for 3 days, the perfect cover for a man who never wanted to admit fault at all. He could have let the scars speak for themselves and moved on without a word, the way some men would have, treating the discovery itself as the apology. He hadn't done that. He'd said the actual words. I was wrong. 3 syllables that shouldn't have mattered as much as they did. And yet, they sat in my chest for 2 days afterward, like something I kept turning over to check it was real. By evening, my phone held several unread messages. None asked for forgiveness. None tried to explain away what had happened. Each one was painfully simple. "Let me know if you need a doctor. I've canceled your assignments for the week. You don't need to answer. Just rest." I read them once before locking the screen again, They sounded sincere, that was the problem. If I answered now, if I accepted his concern the moment it appeared, what would that say about every hour I'd spent convincing myself no one would ever believe me? Would I simply erase all of it because he'd finally seen enough evidence? The question followed me into another sleepless night. Long after the lights were off, I lay awake listening to the quiet rhythm of my own breathing. My body still hurt, but the greater struggle no longer lived beneath my scars. It lived inside the choice waiting for me. I could keep the walls that had protected me for 6 years and never risk being disappointed again. Or I could believe that one man was capable of becoming someone different from the person who had looked me in the eyes and called my pain an act. Neither path promised safety. One guaranteed loneliness. The other demanded a kind of courage I wasn't sure I still possessed. When morning came, I stood by the window watching the city wake below. My phone rested in my hand. Adrian's latest message remained unread. My thumb hovered above the screen without moving. I knew that whatever I chose next would shape far more than our future together. It would decide whether I was finally willing to let someone witness my pain without forcing them to earn another piece of proof first. I unlocked the screen. None of his messages asked me to forgive him. None tried to justify what he'd done. They simply remained there, quiet and unchanged, waiting without demanding anything from me. I stared at the final line until the words lost their shape. You don't need to answer, just rest. I closed my eyes. For 6 years I'd believed silence was the safest place to live. Silence couldn't be twisted. Silence couldn't be dismissed. Silence couldn't be called a lie. But silence had never once protected me from loneliness. It had only made loneliness familiar. I opened a new message and typed 3 words. We need to talk. My finger hovered over the send button longer than it should have. Once I pressed it, there would be no taking the choice back. No pretending I'd never considered trusting him again. I sent it anyway. The reply arrived almost immediately. Name the place. I looked around my apartment before answering. Here, there was no dramatic knock this time. Adrian arrived nearly half an hour later and waited outside without touching the door. Through the peephole, I saw him standing with both hands visible at his sides, instead of folded across his chest. A small thing. Before, I never would have noticed it. Now I understood it for exactly what it was, an invitation instead of a command. I opened the door halfway. Neither of us spoke. He looked tired, not physically. The kind of exhaustion that comes from replaying the same mistake until every version ends the same way. May I come in? He asked. The question caught me off guard. Adrian had spent our entire acquaintance deciding what happened next for both of us. Asking permission sounded almost unnatural coming from him. I stepped aside without answering aloud. He entered slowly, stopping several feet away instead of filling the room with his presence the way he usually did. His eyes never wandered lower than my face. He didn't search for proof anymore. We stood in silence long enough for the quiet to grow uncomfortable. Finally, he broke it. I've rewritten every conversation we've had in my head. I remained still. None of them end well. They already ended, I said. That's the problem. He drew a careful breath. I kept waiting for you to defend yourself. I convinced myself that if you were truly suffering, you would fight harder to make me believe you. Why would you think that? He was quiet long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer at all. Because that's what I would have done, he finally said. If someone doubted me, I would have made them pay for it, one way or another, until they stopped. I judged you against a version of strength that only ever looked like mine. It never occurred to me that yours might look like silence instead. I looked toward the window. Morning light spread across the floor between us. I did fight. He frowned slightly. Not the way you expected. The room fell quiet again. Every time I got out of bed, I continued. Every time I finished what you asked. Every time I stayed standing when my body wanted to stop. That was me fighting. His gaze lowered. I know that now. No, I shook my head. You know it because you saw scars. He closed his eyes for a brief second. You're right, the admission came without hesitation. If I had trusted what you were telling me before I saw them, Milo, he couldn't finish. The sentence collapsed beneath its own weight, and he didn't try to rebuild it. Some sentences I was learning meant more left broken than forced whole. I walked to the kitchen and filled a glass with water, more to steady my hands than because I was thirsty. Adrian didn't follow. He let me choose the distance between us. That more than his apology, forced me to see that he wasn't the same man who had grabbed my wrist away from my own body in that basement. The change was real. The question was whether I could live with it. I set the glass down untouched. "Do you know what frightened me most?" I asked. "When you called me a liar." He looked up. "No. When you believed me." Confusion crossed his face. "Because once you started believing me," I said, searching for words that had lived inside me for years, "I had to decide whether I believed you could actually change." His shoulders fell, ever so slightly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He simply listened. I realized then that this was the first conversation we'd ever had where he wasn't trying to prove himself right, and for the first time I wasn't trying to survive it. I took a slow breath. The ache beneath my ribs remained, but it no longer controlled every decision I made. "I can't pretend the last few days didn't happen," I said. "I won't." Adrian nodded once. "You shouldn't. I can't promise I'll trust you tomorrow. I'm not asking you to. Or next week. I know." I met his eyes. There was still regret there. It hadn't disappeared. Neither had my memories. But regret no longer stood alone. Patience stood beside it now. Respect stood beside that. They couldn't erase what came before. They could only become the beginning of something different. I walked the remaining distance between us, stopping close enough that I no longer had to raise my voice. "If this ever happens again," I said quietly, "don't wait for proof." Adrian held my gaze. "I won't." I believed he meant it. That didn't heal everything inside me. It didn't erase the days I'd spent forcing myself through pain just to satisfy someone else's doubt. What it did was give me a reason to stop hiding behind the silence that had become my only shield for 6 years. I extended my hand, not because everything was fixed, but because rebuilding always has to begin before certainty arrives. Adrian looked at my hand for only a moment before taking it gently, careful not to grip too tightly. Neither of us spoke afterward. Words had carried us as far as they could. What remained belonged to the choices we would make from that moment forward. His hand stayed around mine only long enough to acknowledge the choice. Then he let go before the contact could turn into another kind of pressure. Before he left that morning, he paused at the door, one hand on the frame. "The doctor," he said. "Raise." I meant it, no questions asked. Not from her, not from me. He didn't wait for me to answer, didn't turn it into another thing I owed him a response to. He just wanted it said out loud, once, so I'd have it if I ever needed it. Then he was gone, and I stood in my own doorway for a long moment, holding a kind of quiet I hadn't let myself feel in years. Not the brittle, watchful quiet I'd built my whole life around, but something closer to rest. That restraint followed us into the days that came after. Adrian didn't transform overnight into someone gentle, and I didn't wake up suddenly fearless. Change arrived in smaller ways. He stopped assuming silence meant deceit. I stopped treating every question like a trap. When he needed an answer, he waited for one. When I needed distance, he gave it without making me earn the right to it. The first week passed quietly. My schedule remained clear but not empty. Adrian sent work I could complete from home, stripped of urgency, and, for the first time, without the unspoken test that used to accompany every assignment. He never asked whether I was capable. He asked what I could manage. The difference should have been minor. It wasn't. It reshaped every interaction between us. I began answering his messages instead of staring at them until the screen went dark. At first, my replies were brief. Yes. No tomorrow. Enough for today. He accepted each one without pushing for more. Trust didn't return in a dramatic rush. It gathered slowly, built from moments too ordinary to impress anyone who hadn't lived through what came before them. One of those ordinary moments happened on a Tuesday. My phone rang instead of buzzed, an actual call, which he almost never made anymore, as if he'd learned that a call demanded something a text didn't. I answered on the third ring. "I need the Kessler shipment numbers by Friday," he said, no greeting, in the same voice he'd have used with anyone else on his payroll. Then, after a pause just a beat too long to be nothing, "Can you manage Friday?" It was such a small addition to the sentence. 2 words tacked onto the end of an order, turning it into something closer to a question. I sat with the phone against my ear for a second longer than I needed to, just to feel the shape of it. "Friday works," I said. "Good." Another pause. "If it doesn't, tell me before Thursday, not after. I will." He hung up without saying anything else, and I found myself smiling at a dead phone line in my own kitchen, over nothing more than a man asking instead of assuming. It wasn't romance. It wasn't even particularly warm. It was just proof. delivered in the driest way he knew how, that he'd actually been listening. One afternoon, I arrived at headquarters for the first time since the second warehouse. The corridors looked exactly the same, but I felt different walking through them. No one stared at my side. No one watched for weakness. Adrian had said nothing publicly about what happened, and yet the atmosphere around me had shifted anyway. There were no extra assignments waiting as quiet punishment. No suspicious glances whenever I paused to catch my breath. He'd changed the rules without ever turning my pain into a spectacle for the whole building to witness. I found him in his office standing near the window with several files spread across the desk. He looked up when I entered, and his eyes went first to my face. "Only my face? How are you feeling?" he asked. The old instinct rose immediately. "Fine." The word almost left my mouth out of 6 years of habit. I stopped it. "Sore," I said instead. Adrian nodded. No doubt. No demand for details. No glance toward the place beneath my shirt where proof had once been required before anyone would take me at my word. "Then sit." He moved the nearest chair into an easier position and stepped away. The gesture held no pity. It was practical, respectful. I lowered myself into the seat and waited familiar shame to arrive. It never did. We worked for less than an hour before a dull pressure began to gather beneath my ribs. The sensation wasn't severe, but fear moved through me before the pain even had the chance to fully form. My body remembered the warehouse. My mind remembered every accusation. I placed one hand against the desk, trying to decide whether to speak or simply endure it in silence like I always had. Adrian noticed the pause. He didn't reach for me. He didn't ask what I was hiding. "Do you need to stop?" The question entered the room without a trace of suspicion. I looked at him. Nothing in his expression searched for evidence. He had no idea what the pain actually felt like in that moment. He couldn't see the scars from where he was sitting. He had only my word. "Yes," I said, "that was all." Adrian closed the file in front of him. "Then we're done for today." My chest tightened, but not from the old wound. "You believe me?" The question escaped before pride could silence it. He looked almost wounded by how quietly I'd asked it. "I should have believed you the first time." He didn't turn the statement into an apology about himself. He let it remain what it was, an acknowledgement of what I'd been denied for far too long. I stood carefully. Adrian stayed where he was, close enough to help, far enough to let me choose. That distance had become one of the ways he cared for me now. At the door I paused. "It still hurts," I said, though he hadn't asked. "I know you can't see it." I closed my eyes briefly. "I don't need to." The answer settled somewhere inside me that had remained guarded even after I'd invited him into my apartment, into that conversation, into whatever we were rebuilding together. For 6 years, pain had been a private courtroom where I was both witness and defendant, always searching for evidence strong enough to earn belief from people who'd already made up their minds. Scars had won Adrian's attention once. They were no longer the reason he listened to me. I left the office without forcing my shoulders straight. In the corridor, Sophia was leaning against a supply cart, pretending to sort delivery slips that had clearly already been sorted. She glanced up as I passed. "You're walking different, Milo," she said. "Good different or bad different, like a man who isn't bracing for the next hit." She almost smiled. "He tell you he was wrong? Something like that. Huh." She went back to her papers, but not before adding, quiet enough that it felt like it was meant just for me, took him long enough. It wasn't forgiveness on my behalf. She had no right to grant that, and she seemed to know it. It was simply someone else in the building marking, out loud, that what had happened to me had actually happened, and that it had mattered. I hadn't realized how much I needed a witness who wasn't Adrian until I had one. In the weeks that followed, the space between us kept changing. Concern became familiarity. Familiarity became something closer to trust. Adrian learned when to offer help and when to simply wait. I learned that accepting care didn't erase my own strength. It had just taken me a long time, and the wrong people to believe otherwise. He never touched the scars without permission. He never asked to see them again. Their purpose in our story was finished. They'd revealed the truth once, but they no longer controlled whether that truth was respected going forward. One evening we stood together near the entrance of headquarters after everyone else had already gone home. A light rain had begun outside, tapping softly against the glass doors. I shifted my weight and felt the first warning ache along my side. Adrian noticed the change in my breathing before I'd said a word. "Pain?" he asked. I nodded. He picked up my coat and held it out, not rushing me, not watching for proof this time. "Let's go home." I slipped my arms into the sleeves. His hand hovered near my back as we stepped out into the rain, ready if I needed it, patient if I didn't. Beneath my clothes, the scars remained exactly where they'd always been. But for the first time in 6 years, they felt like part of my body rather than testimony I had to present in order to be believed. I had spoken, he had believed me, and as we walked beneath the darkened sky, I no longer felt the need to hide the way I moved. Each careful step brought me closer to a version of trust I hadn't let myself imagine was possible. Not because the pain was gone, but because, for the first time, someone was willing to walk beside it without demanding I bleed to prove it was real. Somewhere behind us, headquarters went dark window by window as the last of the staff finally went home for the night. Ahead of us, the street lights blurred gold through the rain, and Adrian matched his pace to mine without being asked, the way he'd learned to do in the weeks since the basement. Not slow enough to feel like pity, not fast enough to leave me chasing him. It was such a small adjustment. It had taken him 3 days of accusations and one appeasement full of silence to learn it, and it would probably take the rest of both our lives for me to stop noticing every time he got it right. I decided, walking beside him in the rain with my scars hidden and my guard finally cautiously lowered, that I could live with that kind of noticing. It felt less like keeping score and more like something closer to hope. I thought once that trusting him would feel like a door swinging open, sudden, complete, impossible to mistake for anything else. It hadn't been like that at all. It had been 100 small doors, each one opened a little at a time, each one closable again if he ever gave me reason. He hadn't, not since the basement. I didn't know if he ever would. What I knew was that for the first time in 6 years, I'd stopped bracing for the day someone would ask me to prove my pain was real, and started simply living inside it instead. Scars and all, quietly, without an audience, without needing one. If this story stirred something in you, don't scroll past it in silence. Tell us in the comments what part hit you hardest, or if you've ever had to prove your own pain to someone who should have just believed you. We read every single comment, and honestly, they're the reason we keep telling these stories. See you in the next one.